So I'm delighted to be joined by Sam Sholli, who is a British journalist and documentary maker, a YouTuber. He's been doing a lot of work recently on the Andrew Yang presidential campaign in America, and universal basic income and automation, and all those kind of issues, which I think are really important. So, first of all, Sam, thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you made some really interesting videos about the Andrew Yang campaign. So you did a couple where you went to Oldham, which is a town in the north of England, one of the poorest towns in the UK. And you asked people there what they thought about the idea of universal basic income and whether they'd support it. I'll put links to these videos in the description. Were you surprised by what you found?
Yes, I have to say. So in some respects, yes, in some respects, no. So when it comes to, for example, one of the questions I asked was whether they would like it. So I asked if they'd like the equivalent of, at the time, what was $1,000 a month, which was Andrew Yang's proposal, which was about £822 a month. So what would you do with £822 a month? And one of the questions I asked was, what would you do? Do you think if the UK instituted this on a national level, that it should go on top of disability benefits for people who have disability or not? I thought a lot of people would be more conservatively minded when it came to the economics of it, but not almost uniformly, everyone I asked on and off camera wanted it to be in addition to the benefits that disabled people would receive. There was a strong sense that it would be unjust if people who are disabled didn't receive this on top of what they did. What I'd heard Andrew Yang himself say in a Breakfast Club interview about universal basic income was that he'd seen studies or research that indicated that people often felt that they'd use it a lot better than other people, or a lot more wisely.
Yeah, so I can believe that.
Yes, so I'd ask people how they think they'd use it, and often I'd hear things that were very productive. One lady said that she wanted to save up with a bunch of other people to create a safe house for runaway children. I mean, I'd heard both on and off camera some really fantastic ideas for how the money would be used. But on more than one occasion, when I asked some of those very people, how do you think others would use it? You'd get the response, oh, they'd use it, probably spend it on drink. And then there was also differences in what their expectations were for different demographics. So within those people who felt that others would use it unwisely, they'd caveat that perhaps older people would use it wisely than younger people. Some of them, I'm talking about on and off camera chats here. And some would caveat that they felt the working class people would appreciate it more. There was differences in terms of what people expected of themselves, and between what people would expect of themselves and others, and also when it came to others, differences in terms of what they'd expect of different demographics.
Yeah. Now, at the moment, the whole universal basic income idea is more associated, I'd say, with the left than the right. So, I mean, in Spain, they're planning to or looking to introduce something, particularly for the coronavirus outbreak, but potentially going beyond that. They've got quite a left-wing government. In the UK, John McDonnell said there'd be a trial if Labour won the general election in December. So he was the shadow chancellor. That's not going to happen now. Andrew Yang ran for the Democrats. I mean, what do you think can be done to kind of make the idea more appealing to conservatives, to get conservatives on board?
Well, I think with Andrew Yang's campaign, he did that. If you read Andrew Yang's book, which I've just done a review of the book on my YouTube channel, you can see that there is a tendency for him to try to make it appeal to the right. Don't forget that Milton Friedman, well-known right-wing economist, was actually in favour of universal basic income. Called it the negative income tax. So it's not an idea that has always been uniformly perceived as unpalatable to the right. In terms of the framing, which goes to the point of your question, you could. One of the key points Andrew Yang made was that this would reduce the bureaucracy of some of the existing sort of welfare state in the US. That appeals to, I think, a lot of conservatively minded people who don't like the amount spent on administration, because with the current disability system in the US. There's lots of reporting requirements. There are reassessments. There's actually like an entire industry that is built around trying to make people, for example, lawyers who are trying to make, who try to ensure that applicants for disability are successful. So you often, people who are applying for disability in the US, they'll get lawyers to help them with their application. And this is a big industry in the US now, these lawyers who help with disability. So this would reduce the sort of bureaucracy and all the entanglements that you might find with the state when it comes to the how the state administers the program. That appeals to, I think, maybe not a conservative desire to shrink the state, but certainly one to simplify how it operates. That I would suppose is the main thing. And also Yang also appeals to a sense of entrepreneurship. So what was interesting about his campaign was it wasn't, when he often frames interventions by the state in a way that appeals to people's self-interest or entrepreneurial spirit, which you could say is a rather capitalistic thing to do. He's not viewing the subjects of his policies as vulnerable people that need to be protected. Clearly, there are vulnerable people that need to be protected in society, but a tendency for left-wing politicians is to exclusively talk about state interventions by justifying them in these terms. But Yang, for example, in the sense of when it comes to universal basic income, was talking about how it would create a new wave of entrepreneurship. People would have enough money to spend on businesses. In the book, he actually jokes about how lots of richer children already have a form of universal basic income. It's called income. So when he talks about it in those terms, those are ways it would appeal to the right.
Yeah. So essentially, it's for people who are very poor, who have very low assets and no security, are very likely to start a business. But once you give everyone that kind of very basic level of protection, then it's easier for people to create businesses, and you have a kind of a rise in entrepreneurship.
Also, the fact that I think the crux of the argument relies on if you accept what Andrew Yang says about automation, because a massive state intervention like that makes a lot more sense if you think the labour market is about to change and a stimulus like that is needed, particularly in terms of local economies. If you look at, for example, in Yang's book, I don't know if the statistics are slightly out of date, but the book was published in 2018 originally. You see that almost 50% of the workforce works in 5 different sectors. I can't remember all 5 off the top of my head. I think it was retail, food preparation, transport, administration. I can't remember the 5th, but it's around 48%. I think it was 48% of the workforce that accounts for in the US. And if you think about it, those sectors are all sectors that are being and will continue to be drastically impacted by automation. And if you accept that there'll be less, it's not a case of whether there'll be less jobs available. It's not a case of whether there's going to be no new jobs available. Clearly, automation will bring with it different job opportunities, but it's the case of, will there be more jobs for low and middle income people with low levels of education in places near to where they live? And if the answer is a no to that, if you accept the answer as a no, then the idea of UBI becomes more appealing.
I mean, it almost seems to me, but there were kind of 2 main arguments in favour of universal basic income. So the first, obviously, is automation. Is essentially, but we have to do this because otherwise, a significant section of the population will just have no resources coming in because they're not going to have their traditional jobs. And the second is wealth redistribution. That this is a great way of kind of levelling out the economy, creating a more humane form of capitalism. And I kind of noticed there's a bit of a diversion. So the first argument I associate more with Yang, but also that there's people like Mark Zuckerberg's made big statements kind of interested in it. Elon Musk, a lot of the big kind of tech entrepreneurs have talked about needing a universal basic income because of automation rising. And the second argument, which I more associate with like an older argument from the left, which they're kind of repackaging around universal basic income. I mean, do you think those 2 strands are compatible, or do you think there's some kind of clash between them?
I think the clash often comes. You can see the clash in terms of how the approach should be towards the welfare state in light of people being in favour of a universal income. You can see a clear divergence there between the left and the right, because the right, much of the right, believes that it should replace a lot of the existing benefits structure, social security fabric of any states that where UBI comes into play, but much of the political left believes it should stack on top of that. So you can see the clear divergence there. It's interesting you note Zuckerberg and Musk. I mean, I just saw Jack Dorsey yesterday actually saying that he was going to provide, I think it was 28% of his wealth towards coronavirus relief, and within that announcement said that we're going to have to think more seriously about universal basic income. It is rather interesting to note that a lot of the people who are essentially responsible, who are in the sector which is essentially responsible for thinking of ways to automate away jobs, are seeing the necessity of universal basic income. And
I mean, do you almost think that universal basic income is an inevitability? I mean, it's a question of time. Maybe it won't happen for 10 years, 15 years, but at some point, automation is going to take away so many jobs. We're just going to have no other choice unless you want to have a horrendously unequal society.
I wouldn't like to comment on that myself because I'm not sure. But if I go on what Andrew Yang has said, if we look at, for example, in my video on him, on his book, there's a point in his book where he talks about the next economic downturn is when automation is going to precipitate the coming of cost cutting and efficiency savings from businesses. I mean, I've seen today, for example, that Reach PLC suspended a few of its regional newspaper titles. The Jewish News and Jewish Chronicle have announced that they're about to go into liquidation. So you can see already that the crisis that we're under at the moment, this pandemic, has caused a lot of people to rethink about how their businesses operate. And so automation in that context could be seen as a solution to get efficiency whilst also not increasing the cost of production. Andrew Yang, I think, would think that it would become an inevitability specifically because of the situation we're under. Although you'd have to ask him for sure.
I mean, you've been spending a lot of time hanging around with Andrew Yang supporters. I think you met the Andrew Yang UK fan club, and obviously also, like spending time in their online spaces, that kind of thing. It's interesting. Have you noticed that since the coronavirus crisis, are a lot of them talking about UBI as a kind of potential solution to the current crisis we're in? Because I mean, clearly, since the coronavirus things began, there've been so many people talking about UBI, even as a temporary measure. Are Andrew Yang supporters quite excited that it's now getting serious attention?
Absolutely. I mean, I expect absolutely, and not just so. They were. I've seen a lot of them react positively to the news that Spain is going to introduce what can be considered to be a form of universal basic income. I've seen it disputed among Yang fans whether it's not. But what was interesting about that news was the Deputy Prime Minister of Spain actually said that this could become a more permanent measure rather than just a temporary one. So yes, it is exciting for them, but clearly they're not. Then it's better than what we have now to them, but clearly their desire is for it to be a more permanent measure.
I mean, critics of universal income say, or at least a lot of conservative critics say, I mean, what's the argument for giving, Sir Richard Branson or Elon Musk another $1,000 or the UK equivalent a year? I mean, isn't there a case to be more means tested and targeted at those people who really need it?
It's the argument as far as conservatives are concerned would be that to counter that would be that means testing often results in a lot of bureaucracy, and that would simplify the state, as we were talking about before. For the left, the arguments I think are a bit more convincing, which is if you look at things through a left-wing lens, which is the argument for universalism is an important one. One, because it reduces, and this is actually something that could appeal to the right. It reduces the social stigma attached. I mean, as I'm sure many people know, a lot of people on benefits feel like society is looking down upon them. Feel that they feel that society sees them as a burden. If everyone were to get this, then it would reduce the view that the social stigma people feel. And also it makes it more difficult to cut, because programs which people benefit from universally are people are less likely to there's less likely to be a movement against it, or a movement towards it being reduced or slashed, because everyone benefits from it. No one wants to defeat their own self-interest in getting the money. It's one of the reasons why the NHS, you're not going to see a mass movement to cut funding for the NHS, because everyone benefits from the NHS. Everyone pays into it. It builds a societal solidarity around the idea. So these are the so it's got the argument for universality rather than means testing can appeal to both the left and the right, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah. Now, one thing I noticed from Andrew Yang's support is a lot of them think there's kind of going to be a more fundamental restructuring of our economy. So not just millions of jobs lost to automation, but I mean, potentially certain sections of the population becoming economically inactive because they just can't compete with robots and with the AI which is coming. And as a result, we're going to have to build a really quite different society. I mean, perhaps even in the long term, heading towards a kind of post-compulsory work society. I mean, do you think that kind of stuff is utopianism, or do you think there's like an element to it? I mean, could automation and AI get so advanced? And is this a serious concern for people like Andrew Yang? But this stuff's going to get so advanced that at some point we're going to have to build a very different type of society.
I think there's definitely merit to it, because it doesn't take a massive leap of the best way I could put it is, because people will often say, well, we've had automation in the past, it hasn't resulted in the things that you've said it does. I think one point to say here is the invention of the car isn't the same as the invention of the self-driving car. That is to say, the level of technology we're talking about is far more advanced, and it means that the amount of people needed to operate such technology is probably going to be less than it was in the past. So this is if you accept that, then I think you have to have a different approach to the economy going forward. It doesn't take a massive leap of imagination to imagine, for example, when you go for a McDonald's drive-through, there not being a worker there. You just order food on a machine. I mean, you see that already. Sometimes you do order it into. There's obviously someone on the phone there. Take a massive leap of imagination to imagine, for example, a robot
giving you your food as well.
A machine that takes your order. A robot gives you your food. And
aren't there some supermarkets in, I think it's Seattle, which are entirely automated? So as you go through with your trolley, and you put stuff in the trolley, and it automatically works out what you've got in there. So at no point do you have to interact with another human, or even with like a self-checkout machine.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know about that particular example, but that wouldn't surprise me. The real distinction is between routine and non-routine work. If you think about it in those terms, then it begins to make a lot more. Yang's worldview begins to make a lot more sense. And actually, the impact, I think, is going to be far more far-reaching than a lot of people think, including myself before I read Andrew Yang's book, because when you think about it in through that lens, routine versus non-routine, then you begin to see that actually even white-collar jobs are going to be affected as well. I mean, we're both journalists. We know a lot of the stories that are written by news outlets every day are very routine stories that can probably, if the technology is there, be written by AI. Andrew Yang actually opens one of the chapters of his book with an to demonstrate this point with an article that's been written by AI, and it's a very functional, coherent piece.
Yeah.
Now, whether that will change journalism or not for the better is another discussion. But it will drastically impact the labor market, and even things which require human creativity. You could argue, for example, I mean, if you Google ADSUM on YouTube, you will ADSUM. You will see an orchestra playing, and I believe it was there was some role played in that piece by AI. So, and then for example, Andrew Yang in his book talks about the example of a therapist that is not human, that and actually that veterans have been using. They've been testing that out. So this will have far-reaching impact, and I think we have to be wary of that. I think it will transform the labour market for sure.
Yeah. I mean, just one final question. So, let's say you've obviously been hanging around with a lot of Yang supporters. Admittedly, they might be a bit different in the UK to the US, but also spending time with them on, American Yang supporters online, that kind of thing. And one thing I've noticed is they're so damn enthusiastic. I think Andrew Yang was called the internet's favourite candidate. They're really good with memes, all the social media stuff.
Yes.
What do you think it is that makes them just so passionate? I mean, even more so than the supporters of, on average, of some of other candidates.
I think because Yang is a unique candidate in many respects. I mean, this was something I was actually prepared to talk about before coming on. Okay, numerous things. So just to tell you a bit about myself, I'm often very interested in candidates, politicians, figures that break the sort of norms of politics, that break with convention. And Yang does this in so many different ways. For one thing, his embracing of, and this is why a lot of fans are enthusiastic, because they see a genuinely new, fresh politician in many respects. One thing is the embracing of new media outlets. He went on the Joe Rogan podcast.
And that was when it went big, wasn't it? After the Joe Rogan thing.
Yes, that's a lot of fans. If you speak to them about how they found out about Andrew Yang, it will be through the Joe Rogan podcast. Went on the Ben Shapiro show. Went on lots of different. Went on the Humanist Report, which is a left-wing show. So what was very keen to embrace the online world in a way other candidates perhaps weren't, or because and actually it takes, I think, a lot of bravery to go on something like the Joe Rogan podcast, which I think a lot of his fans respected, because it's 3 hours long. The potential to make a gaffe or a mistake is a lot, and he performed very well on that, it has to be said. So that was one thing. Another thing is just how much fun Andrew Yang had on the campaign, and not in a sort of forced, robotic kind of way, in a way that really brought out his natural, in a way that really showed his natural personality. There was a real exuberance about the way he acted. Crowd surfing. I think he poured cream to a supporter's mouth at one point.
He did what? Sorry, in a supporter's mouth?
Yeah, a supporter opened his mouth and he poured whipped cream into it.
I also said peed in a supporter's mouth.
No.
That would have got in the headlines.
No, and dancing, in a really skateboarding. He was really having fun. He was having the time of his life, and also not doing as someone who's actually very enthusiastic about what he wants to do for the world. A lot of politicians talk about hope and change, but in their rhetoric, but they spend an awful lot of time talking about the ills of society, negatively campaigning against their opponents. So on one hand, you have this talk of hope and change, but then you have a lot of negative campaigning, a lot of negative slogans against other candidates, against competitors, a lot of talking about how terrible society is. So there is a sort of a difference here, that a lot of sort of attachment between what they're claiming to represent and what they're actually doing. And Yang doesn't do that. He spent very little time talking about Donald Trump, other than in the context of how we've got to this point. The majority of his time is spent talking very positively about universal basic income and his other policies. Genuinely focusing more on the hope he can offer rather than the problems he seeks to solve.
So one thing I found really interesting about Andrew Yang is that he seems to think of Trump as more a symptom of the problem rather than the problem itself. So a symptom of automation. So a lot of the states who voted heavily for Trump in 2016 are states which have had high levels of automation, and that's obviously likely to continue. And therefore, to stop the populist right or the authoritarian right continuing to rise, you have to have solutions in place for people who are losing their jobs. And what do you think about that?
Yes, well, I think it as purely as a sort of, in terms of him telling that story, it shows his ability to talk, to put problems and his solutions into a wider context that makes sense to American people. This is actually part of the genius from Yang when it came to in terms of how he went on. Part of the genius of Yang in how he campaigned was him going on these programs like these shows like Joe Rogan's, because they're long form and he can explain that context. He can justify those positions without as much interruption. If Yang went on a 3-minute interview on CNN and simply said, I want to give Americans $1,000 a month. I want to give Americans $100 every year so they can donate to political campaigns. And I think the president should get a 10x raise to $1 million a year. A lot of people would think he's insane. But when Yang puts it into context, tells the story about how automation has changed US society over the years, talks about how the gains, the gains in terms of productivity from the 1970s haven't been distributed fairly for the American worker. When he talks about the erosion of trust in institutions since the 1970s, which isn't just a flippant remark, it is borne out by polling data from Gallup. These solutions then tend to make more sense, and therefore his opposition to Trump is also rooted in a wider explanation, which of how he believes society has developed, which doesn't make it seem as confrontational, and it shows why a lot of former Trump supporters even found his message attractive. Because he didn't like he personally attacking them.
I saw somewhere that amongst Democrat candidates, the two most popular, the two that had over 10%, I think, of Trump supporters saying they might vote for them, were Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, who are both, I guess, the kind of the most obvious change candidates. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, well, I think part of that is the point I mentioned just now about the erosion of trust in institutions. I mean, that could since the 1970s. Part of it isn't probably because you might ascribe part of that down to how there's just we're in an age of mass media, much more so than the 1970s, and there's just more scrutiny and we can see politicians for their flaws a lot more. But also, we've in the US, they've had the Iraq War, the financial crash. You can see why there pivotal moments in that period, why there's been, to explain why there's been a loss of trust in sort of what people would call the establishment. So that partly explains Trump's rise, it partly explains Bernie Sanders' rise, and it partly explains Andrew Yang's rise. And just on the point of him being an outsider, it also, I think, allowed him to be a bit more humane if that makes sense. There's one speech where Yang talks about how he knew people who had in part been responsible for the financial crash that happened, or they'd played a role in some of the misconduct that had happened up to that point. And he says something like, I couldn't be like too mad at them because they were my friends, but I was just like a really thing to do. And I think that was a really interesting comment, because I can't imagine Joe Biden saying, I was friends with these people on was it Wall Street, and I think that demonstrates he had more leeway to say stuff like that as an outsider. And I also think that that demonstrates a level of sort of humility and not a lack of sort of a moralistic tone to what he's saying, because I think deep down we can all empathize with that situation. We have things we sort of do but grit our teeth at when we do our jobs, and we have things that we don't approve that our friends do, but we'd feel it hard to give up on the amount of emotional investment and time we put into our friends for because of those mistakes. You as a human being, you deal with that in your life. You will often deal with that inner conflict between good and bad, and you have to form your code of ethics around that. It's black and white. And I think that Yang's ability to sort of convey that he himself went through that was one of the reasons why people saw him as not somebody who's come down from high to deliver all the solutions for society, but just another human being like us, in quotes, that is looking for solutions. And there's lots of and if you read his book, there's lots of moments where you can see he's implicitly admitting to his own frailty and vulnerability as a human, in terms of, and his own struggles that he's gone through in his life. And so again, this all builds the picture of someone who's not presenting themselves as an angel, but rather an imperfect person like the rest of us, who's just looking for answers to problems.
Yeah. Well, Sam, so I think I said about like 3 or 4 questions back. It'll be one more question, and I completely failed in that regard. But yeah, that's been really interesting. Thanks a lot for your time. So I'll make sure the links to your Andrew Yang videos are in the description. If any listener likes this kind of conversation, please do subscribe. It's a tiny channel so far, but together we can change that. And yeah, so thanks a lot, everyone.